it's a very interesting print shop here in Los Angeles. I've been working with them for many years. The technique they do in terms of paper making, it's very interesting. So I thought I'll give you a summary of my practice, and then at the end we'll get into like the mixographia process, and then afterwards, you're welcome to ask any questions. And even while I'm doing the talk, if anyone needs to ask a question, like I'm very open to it. So I'm going to start with this piece. I would say it's one of the first pieces that, really made me think about my practice in a different way. I was thinking a lot about like, what is a painting? What is a sculpture? And what are we looking at when we're looking at the painting? So this is basically a painting that I found, and then I started unraveling the canvas thread by thread, which made me think of a painting as a sculpture. Let me see if I can move along. This is a bigger version of that. It's called the painting ball. And instead of one painting, it was 100 paintings, all different sources of painting. I was thinking about even like, why do people paint? And what is art? Why are we looking at it? And I'm thinking like, what are all the different practices of painting? So some people paint as a hobby, some people paint just because they love to paint, some people paint professionally. There are painting factories that make reproductions of painting over and over again, and they sell them in case you want to have like a reproduction of Van Gogh or a Dali. Usually they're like the super famous paintings that get reproduced, many of them in China. So there are like many different practices of painting, also in terms of materials. So here you see like a painting in a different way. So usually we see them on the wall with the pigment attached to it. In this case, you see it as like a ball of thread with the pigment. It's basically those little particles when you rip them apart. And we have oil, we have acrylic paint, we have tempera, we have encaustic paint, which is another technique I use. So what are all the different materials when it comes to painting, and what are those materials made of? In this case, I was thinking a lot about knitting as a practice. I come from a family that like they all love to knit, and it was kind of like a very like immediate gesture. So, when you have like a big ball of thread, the one thing you have to do is like make it into a ball, otherwise it will get like entangled and it will get very messy. Then once you have the ball of thread, then you want to like reknit it because you just want to do something with it. So in this case, these are 10 different paintings, and you see where one begins and the other one ends. You see all different materials, different textures, and then you can almost imagine what the painting used to be. So maybe this was some type of darker abstraction. You see a lot of like black attached to the canvas thread. Then maybe this was like a smaller painting. So you kind of like start seeing things in a different way. Then this was, turning a painting into a scarf. I thought, it was kind of funny, but at the same time, a little existential in terms of what is a painting? What do we need as humans? I remember when I did this piece, somebody said, you know what, like it's true, because if like all you have at the end of the day is a painting on the wall, and, like the electricity is gone, there is no gas, you can't even warm up your house, and like all you have is the painting on the wall, maybe you just want to wear it. I mean, so basically it's like looking into a different material and trying to acknowledge what it is. This is also a detail of that. In this case, you can imagine what it was. It was a landscape. So you see like the greens, the reds from the flowers, you see like a little bit of the blues from some type of like sky. Or so I thought it was also interesting to like challenge our vision of things and try to kind of figure out and think about abstraction in painting, think about just, trying to see things from a different perspective. Then moving on, I was thinking a lot about like how does a painting even work? And I know it sounds maybe like naive, but I think it's interesting sometimes to approach a subject matter as if you were like a total alien and you go into a museum and you're like, why is the paint attached to the canvas? Like, why is not like falling on the ground? Like, how does this relationship work between like substrate and material? How does this work, right? Like, why is this like a square object hanging on the wall, and why are people looking at it? Like really like basic questions. So I thought another way of like looking at the painting was like, okay, like you have this object, the paint, and you have this substrate, the canvas. So like, is there another way to connect the two? So one was using tape. So to do that, these are, the brush strokes are acrylic paint. I was thinking a lot about like, what is acrylic paint? And basically it's a plastic, it's a polymer. So it doesn't even need to be painted on canvas at this point in history. It can just be painted and on a table, and then it can like be peeled off from the table, and you can just hold it as an object. So then I was like, well, so then you can just, stick it to the canvas, or you have to find another way to like connect the two. Then the issue of wet paint, I think it's very important. I think of us like as bodies of, red pigment, humans, we are wet. And I think about like, is this the reason why we have this like, maybe unconscious connection with painting? Like, why do we keep looking at painting? I think a lot of people, and if you ever painted, like there is a lot of satisfaction in working with paint. Like I think that's why like painting as a hobby is like so important. There is so much pleasure that one gets from mixing colors, from like playing with substance. It's very like, I think it's like a very primitive impulse, kind of like a child would like start, playing with paint and then like putting like the fingerprints all over, or even a cave painting. So I was thinking about like paint as a wet medium and the pleasure of seeing the wet paint that only happens in the studio, because then when it's outside the studio, usually we see like dry painting that's done. So I'm like, is there any way to preserve the paint wet? So this is like, I came up with this type of like food conservation type of plastic sealing, and it's all vacuum sealed, so the air goes out and then the oil stays vacuum into this plastic, and then it stays wet for really long time. Actually, they're still wet after something like 18 years or something. Same idea. I was thinking about like what the line is. Why is the line inside the canvas? Like, why can't the line exist and transcend the painting space or the canvas? So this is a line that goes basically on top of the canvas and then off the canvas. So it kind of transcends the space. It's all connected into this black plastic bag. And it's basically this type of like, it's almost philosophical, and it's almost like, I think about the soul and whether like we do transcend or not, and like the fact that like by chance a line could go into the canvas and make some type of landscape. In this case, if you want to read it as a landscape, or you could just read it as a black line, and the gesture of the line itself. So it's all contained in the plastic bag, and it's also still wet. And it continues to be wet and continues to expand. As you can see, like slowly there is oil and there is pigment. So it's slowly like those two components separate. So I think it's also interesting to see it aging. I think the question of age and time, I've always been very interested in that when it comes to painting. I think we share this time issue with artwork. I mean, we are aging beings, and the paintings also, are exposed to the elements. I think museums care about them. They have to preserve them. Sometimes they kind of go into the hospital, which is like a conservation lab. Sometimes they have to fix them. And then how does the relationship to time and space, have like a real dialogue in terms of art? So I thought maybe the time machine or the clock could be, or even like the flowers that usually age very quickly. how does that affect the actual object? Then these pieces were about thinking about painting as a body, as a container of paint in a way. So I was like, can we kind of recontextualize a painting? And usually we see like the painting on the wall. So I'm like, well, if I see a painting on the wall, but then I'm also thinking of like almost a sculptural object, because it's always an object sitting on the wall, like hanging on the wall. I was thinking, well, can it be, can it really be a sculpture? Can we look at the painting as a container of paint? So these were like these painting bags, and they sit on the floor and they lean against the wall, and then you see a lot of paint inside the bag, and then like some of it starts zipping out. Can I make a drawing with this technique? So in this case, can I make an actual grid? We see a lot of grids in like, people like Agnes Martin, also Sol LeWitt, like these are all like important moments for me that, important artists that have always been very influential. So I'm like, well, can I make my own grid? So if I want to like kind of reverse the process, instead of painting on canvas, if I want to have like a bag of canvas and the paint will be like in the inside, and then it's almost like canvas on paint, because I'm reversing the order, can I make a grid this way? And of course, it's like a very dysfunctional grid. It's like almost exploding from the inside. But at the same time, like you do see the image coming through, through this canvas. Sometimes it was almost like coming out too much, so we had to stitch it back. And I thought even that was like an interesting reference to like the body or this type of anatomy, like in that, like when we start bleeding out, you have to like stitch it back together, and what's that relationship? These are more, I guess, more graphic images. So in this case, it's a group of brush strokes instead of a grid. And I was like, can I make a drawing of brush strokes? Basically, the canvas in this case, it's cut just on the surface, it's cut a little bit. So enough for the pressure of the wet paint to come out. And as you can see here at the bottom, like, that's like when the paint really starts coming out and zipping out. I really, as you can see, I love to think about the surface and, how does that work? Like what is that relationship between painting and canvas? So for this one, I kind of made a whole painting, but I spray the canvas with a silicone coat that like basically the paint couldn't attach to it. So it was kind of, if you can think about it as like baking a cake and like spraying the mold, so it would like, it won't, stick to it. Basically by spraying the canvas, then I would like paint on top, and then I could like peel the painting from the canvas. I thought it was very interesting, almost like turn it into like a coat, like a real coat of paint, but like, like the coat of paint that like, the canvas is wearing. I thought it was fun to like, to show the two surfaces, because in the inside you see like the imprint of the actual canvas. So you see the fabric almost printed on the inside of the paint, and then the outside you see the brush strokes. So I think it's fun to like look inside, right? I mean, wouldn't it be cool to like be able to like peel the Mona Lisa and see like kind of like the layer in between, the layer between the canvas and the layer of, the picture layer. So I was just happy to like be able to kind of like peek inside or like remove the mystery in a way, trying to expose this like inner layer. thinking a lot about acrylic paint and the fact that it's almost a plastic, as I said. I was like, why do I even have to paint it on canvas? Can I make it really into a sculpture? And when I was thinking about the sculpture, I'm like, what type of sculpture should I make? Should it be like a real sculpture, like a solid, mass of acrylic paint? Or should I be something thin that like plays with this idea of surface? Or should it be something like, in this case, I thought, well, maybe like, to cast a plastic bag. So in a way to like think about like the plastic bag and the acrylic paint as a plastic. So this piece is all made out of acrylic paint. And then the canvas, it's kind of just thrown there, kind of in the bag, which I think has the sense of humor. It's also, of course, thinking a lot about painting as a product, as a commodity, like what's the meaning about it, what's the meaning of paint itself, and also what's the meaning of sculpture. These are these nice moments where I think we experiment so much in the studio that this was a really nice day for me, in that the Getty research, the Getty Conservation Institute, they knew that we were doing all these paint experiments. It was really fun to see them, to see their interest, and to basically to have them visit the studio just because they were curious about what are you guys doing with paint. So this is the whole team of scientists at the Getty Conservation Institute, and they just came just to see our experiments with paint. Here in the background, you see some like paintings that we were like carving with the laser machines. So like really like turning like sculpting in painting. This blue piece on the wall was like kind of using like a painting machine that we kind of came up with this idea. And then on the tables, we had these molds that we use, basically casting objects and then filling those molds with acrylic paint and then peeling them off and making all these objects. In this case, you see this trash bag. It's basically a trash bag. You see both sides. It's from a real trash bag. So we casted the shape. Then here on these boxes, you see all the little pieces to make the knot of the trash bag, which is really hard if you want to like make a sculpture of that, if you want to cast the knot of the trash bag. And then the product at the end was this like trash bag made out of acrylic paint. And so you see kind of, how we made it. We had a very funny story with this piece that we were, one piece was acquired by a collector in Paris, and they had it in his apartment. And then at some point, somebody, like thieves, they broke into the apartment, and then like, they were like, they messed the whole apartment up, and they like kept looking for like valuables, and then like they like ripped it open to like see whether like there was something inside. And of course, they completely destroyed the piece, which is very sad, but like it is kind of a funny story. So it's just it really like had the purpose. It worked. Like it even fooled the thieves. This is a cast also. So I was thinking about brushes, and the toilet brush came to mind. I think it's a very fascinating object. So I was like, what's the difference between, like a brush that we buy at the art store? Some brushes could be like $50 or more, like, very pricey just for like one brush. But then I was like, what's the difference with like, the $3 brush or $1 brush at the at the 99-cent store. So I was just like really trying to like think about like art tools and techniques and what do they mean. So I made this brush. It's also made out of acrylic paint, and you see the mold. It's a very complex object to make, because as you can see, it has the handles. So you have to cast both sides of the handles, and then you have like all the little things for the bristles, and the bristles, get inserted in each one of these little holes. So it's just, a little bit of, I don't know, appreciating the actual toilet brush that we totally take for granted, but I think it's like a very interesting shape and the construction of it. And then I thought, well, it'd be fun to like make this type of like existential marks, very raw, very like, very similar to like you know, like in an old bar or something, you see like, you know, these like marks on the wall in an old restroom, and to make them with the actual brush. So this was like a fun way, totally dysfunctional. Of course, it's not a brush that like it's smooth or it works well. But still, I thought it had like a presence, it had its own gesture, and I thought it'd be interesting to embrace that. This is the same brush, just cast in a different color. And this was part of my first New York exhibition. The title was called Gag. So it was like almost like a very violent, like the act of gagging, but also like the humor of like gagging as if I'm laughing. So it had like these two tensions, opposite tensions in the show that I hope to always have in the work. Also, the bag is full of paint, so you can kind of have the interaction between like the brush, which is made out of paint, and the bag, which is like made out of canvas. It's painting canvas, cotton, and then it's also full of this gray paint. Thinking a lot about the body and its connections to painting. This piece is called Trough, and it's basically my body weight in paint. So the length of it, the width of it, or the length of it, is my height. So it's almost as if I'm like lying in there. Very traditional in terms of materials. It's linen canvas, but it's primed. That's why the white comes in. So it's really as if I'm preparing a surface for painting, as if I were just going to paint, but instead of like stretching it super tight. Tension is a very important part of painting, which I think it's also something to think about. When you like stretch a canvas, you have to like deal with tension, like stretch it very, very like strong and tight. In this case, I thought, well, can I like just let it very loose, and will it like make some type of cavity? So it's almost as if I'm lying there, and then inside it's oil paint in this type of like skin color, or like a flesh tone, and it's 125 pounds of paint in this case. So it was like my body weight in paint, and then this is oil. So I think it's important, like every subject matter, to choose the material depending on what I'm trying to say conceptually. I felt when I was like talking about sculpture and all that, like I'm like acrylic paint made a lot of sense. But when I was talking about the body, I was like, well, maybe oil paint is like more relevant, because I feel like we are like oily people. And I think it's like a fun dialogue to think about it. I think a lot about like the meaning of paint. What is paint made of? If you think about it, paint can be made of anything. It can be made of, eggshells or mango leaves to make yellow, eggshells to make white, minerals, carbon. So, what is paint, and how do we use it? This is my studio. I thought I'll share some interesting like behind the scenes type of works. So this is my studio very recently. I like to talk about these very traditional techniques and paint and all this, but at the same time think about technology. I think it's very important. How does technology play a role in art? I think it does. We're always mediated through the advances of technology. This is a laser cutter that I use a lot, and we have it in the studio, which is great because we can experiment a lot with the laser cutter. In this case, this is a canvas, a normal canvas, but then I'm like, can I carve it? Like, can I actually carve a painting as if I was carving a piece of marble, basically? So in this case, I'm like, with the laser, I'm like removing. So here it's like, I'm not touching it at all. Then I'm removing maybe like 5% of the material, and then 10%. The laser is basically heat. It's like a beam of heat, a beam of fire. So then like it's burning more and more and more, maybe like 50%, 70%, 80, 90, until like it really like burns it completely and it just disintegrates. So I thought it would be an interesting way of carving. in this case, I was like, can I make a drawing with that fire, with the fire of the laser? This is a piece that's, it's really basically like, you know, almost breaking the whole thing. But there is this drawing that's like not touched by the laser. So the drawing stays, this like structure, and everything else is basically falling apart. I think it had to do with, you know, sometimes how we feel about things, that things can change. I mean, like the world, and like how, you know, all of a sudden, like we have these tensions of, you know, feeling that everything is kind of falling apart, and at the same time, like rebuilding and putting those pieces back together. So I think the tension in these pieces is something that I always want to explore. Like this one, it's a building that could like completely collapse, but at the same time, there is like this very basic structure, just like a building would work, like a skeleton of the building that actually does, in most cases, keep it together. So this is an extremely fragile example of, you know, there is very little remaining, but the drawing is in a way that like it does kind of stay together. Then the opposite of that, I'm like, okay, like if I'm working with a very fragile material, I was like, can I work with concrete and make that a drawing? I love this idea of like thinking of minimalism and thinking about the material like that's as mundane as concrete, like basically on the floor in a parking lot, like we don't even look at it. But then like, I mean, it's really kind of an incredible material. It starts with a bag of sand, basically, and some chemicals, and then it hardens. And then there is this beautiful drawing that is on the surface that really reminds me of minimalism. This piece, I was, we're like getting closer to the end, so no worries. I know it's a lot of material, but these pieces came right after, and I think living in Los Angeles and thinking about earthquakes and how like the earth is constantly changing, that's been very influential. Also in terms of art history, the idea of drapery and carving. So the same way I was like carving a painting or carving different materials. I was like, well, you know, can I do something with marble that's not carving, that, you know, it's something unique of these times, but it does embrace the language of draped marble. I think drapery and fabric in marble, it's something that's very recurrent. It shows the artist hand. It shows how it's kind of amazing that you could start with like a piece of mountain basically and start carving it until it looks like a piece of fabric. So I thought, well, I don't have that skill, but I still have the ideas of it. So could I turn a slab of marble into something that drapes? So these pieces are called draped marble, and they really do embrace that history and that language. But of course, it's like a totally different way of drapery when it comes to marble. And then how would that look if I was draping concrete? So in this case, we like start with very thick slabs of concrete that we pour in the studio. And then how would those drape on a piece of wood or on a sawhorse? You see a few like backstage production of this process. This is all in the studio, so we don't have like the best facilities for it, but you know, we still have to like figure out how to do it. And in this case, we went from the draped marble to the draped concrete to folded concrete. So I was thinking like, can I fold a piece of concrete as if I was like folding a piece of paper, basically? So thinking about brochures and that type of language, like, so if you have like a little pamphlet, you have the zigzag fold, which is this one, or the gate fold, or this type of like fold, which I think it's like the 3-part fold. So I think it's always interesting to challenge materials, you know, to think that, you know, a piece of concrete might not be so easy to fold, but it's still foldable. And to think about, you know, the earth constantly folding. This is something we experience in LA a lot, but we also experience it when you're like looking at trees, and you see like the roots come through the sidewalk, and you also see the sidewalk folding. And I was like, oh, that's just like an interesting way to think about materials. This is, again, thinking about pigments and the fact that, you know, many pigments came from minerals. I thought, well, maybe like I can actually like include the pigment in like its mineral form and just weave it through the actual canvas. And then think about, again, like, what is a painting? And can I paint with something else? Can I make paint out of like the bathroom sink, which is kind of like the kitchen sink story? But it was like, would it be interesting to really challenge the concept of painting? So this is like a piece, it's like ground, and then the same pigment, which you don't see so much, but the powder becomes the pigment, and it kind of like makes the gesture on the canvas. It's very beautiful. It was like porcelain. So it was like a way of using like the ready-made pigment coming from something non-traditional. And then like, well, there is also paint in a car. When you think about like how a car is made, like the paint is very powerful. It's really beautiful in a way. It's like very like fine. It has to be exposed to all the elements when you're driving, right? Like the rain and the wind and the heat and the sun. And it's still like, you know, like it stays like in very good shape. So I was thinking of like car paint and how high-tech car paint is. We have done a lot of progress when it comes to like industrial pigments and paints, and that's really like one of them. And then I thought, well, can I paint with like the ready-made car paint? I mean, can I do like an actual like gesture painting? So encaustic paint, which is a wax-based medium that's been used in Egypt, in many like in Pompeii. I mean, it's a very traditional, like very old way of painting. It's basically beeswax, tamar resin, and pigment. We cook it in the studio. It's almost like making a large soup. And then I thought, what can I do now with this like very old formula of painting? And then I came up with these objects that really like come off the wall, and they're also very sculptural. And this is one of the latest projects, which has been to like weave paint and canvas at the same time. So we make this, the paint as like very long pieces of paint, and then the paint is woven at the same time with the actual thread in the loom that you saw. So this is acrylic paint, and we make this like very long type of brush strokes on a table, and then we peel them off, and then we have a weaver. I say we because it's like a real like team project. We have a weaver that actually weaves the paint and the canvas together, and that became more complex in recent times. I started weaving this type of tapestries, but they come from actual circuit boards. I think it's very interesting to think about tapestry and the loom. It's like basically a mathematical formula. When it comes to the loom, it's a binary code. It's like the thread either goes up or down. So it's basically like, it's basically based on math. It's basically a very early computer. So I thought it'd be interesting to embrace like the computer image when it comes to the weavings. And then most recently, instead of paint on canvas or paint through the canvas, started using copper. And I think copper is also like a very beautiful, interesting material. It comes from electronics, and it has like its own presence in itself. So these are also circuit boards. They're made with copper. And I think they really speak of these times in terms of what we have available and what are the materials we use the most just in our daily lives, which is a lot related to electronics and our relationship with computers. And then finally, I come to the piece that's at the museum right now, and this collaboration with Mixografia. We're very lucky in LA to have very cool print shops that do very interesting techniques that I wouldn't be able to do in the studio. So it's a real pleasure to have access to that, and to have access not just to the technique, but also to a group of experts that can handle them really well. So different print shops do different techniques. Some are more traditional in terms of printmaking. Some are more like high tech, and Mixographia, its strength is to do this paper making. They do the paper in the shop. So they start with these buckets of paper pulp that you can see here. So it's very similar to things that we would do in the studio, but a totally different setup. So this is the paper pulp, and then they make these molds, and they can press the paper pulp into the mold. So very similar to the objects I was doing with paint, but in their case, they do it with paper. It's something that only they do, and I've been fascinated with the technique from day one. They work with many other artists, but I also felt it really like connected with the way I see art and the way that I experiment in the studio. So it was a very organic collaboration. And so they basically make this paper pulp, these paper molds, they press the paper into the shape. And then, as you can see, this would be like the back of the piece. So it's one piece of paper that has this sculptural shape. And then on the other side, so this is the back, this is the front. So in the front side, you can see like the actual print, where like it all happens at the same time. So they can like ink the mold, press the paper onto the mold, and, you know, instead of being like a flat type of plate, which is usually the case when it comes to intaglio or lithography, in this case, the plate in a way has this shape, and then they can press the paper pulp onto it, and then once it comes out, it's all together as one piece. The piece of paper with this shape, and then the ink printed on the shape. So I think we're right on time. And if anyone has any questions, I say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and share with us your thoughts.
Hi, Analia, I have a question. My question goes back to the very beginning when you were taking apart canvas paintings. And I can't remember if I've asked you this before, but were you using like a seam ripper, or what implement were you using to take them apart, or were you just simply doing it by hand?
Yeah, it's a very lovely question. And I actually made a little video about this because it's very touching story, and, you know, very particular and like intimate, and you would never know. But like basically when I was growing up, my uncle had this beautiful fabric shop in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. And, you know, they're like Jewish family doing like fabrics, which is funny because I'm still doing fabrics, even though I'm like totally into contemporary art, but I guess it's really in my DNA. And I really love just, you know, being in the shop, watching all the samples, and, you know, they would give me all these like endless samples of fabric that I could, you know, make my own little doll clothes and so on. But the coolest thing for me was like seeing them cut the fabric. And usually, like, you know, instead of like cutting the fabric with like scissors and go all the way to the other side, what they do is like they cut just the edge of it, and then they rip it apart, and then like it just kind of flies, and it just also cuts really nicely because it follows the weave, and then very quickly like you have like a perfect cut. And then so I kind of connected those dots in terms of like my personal history, that, to be honest, when I was doing the painting ball, I never put the two and two together, but that's exactly how we like did it. We like had these canvases, and I say we because I started on my own. I was super young. I couldn't really afford any type of assistant or help. But at the same time, like the painting ball became so heavy and I couldn't like move it and turn it anymore. So at some point I was in the studio and I went outside and I was kind of freaking out. I'm like, I can't continue this project because I can't turn the ball and, you know, keep rolling it and keep putting the thread around the ball, because it's like now I think it weighs like 300 pounds or something. So I just couldn't turn it. And I saw a worker, like, someone from construction, like walking by the studio at that time. I said, hey, you, like, do you mind giving me a hand? Because I need to like keep turning the ball. At the end, I had, he had a friend and they work on the painting ball for like a week or two. And they helped me like keep, because I just wanted to have that volume where it would like have presence in the space. To have that volume, we just had to keep adding and adding and adding. Like a lot of people are like, wait, is it like all solid, or is there like a ball of styrofoam inside? And I'm like, no, it's like solid. Like and it was really intense. But anyway, so that's the story. So I actually then later on, I was doing I was like the guest at this big gala for the Israel Museum. And so I wanted to like talk about my family history. I mean, how did I get to, be here, make art now? So I asked my uncle to like shoot a little video of him like, ripping the fabric apart. And it's really beautiful. I was just, so I can share that. And it's just exactly what we did with the painting ball, many years later in the studio. So it's like, it's a simple question, but it really has the story.
Thank you. I would imagine, sorry, just one follow-up, to think that in the process of doing that, there must have been some of the paint that just kind of came off and like made a dust coating on the floor or something like that, so that not everything, because it was so interesting to see those details where you see the bit of paint on the canvas and then you also see the like back of the canvas that is uncolored, and thinking of it popping and cracking and probably making a kind of like dust around while you're doing all this ripping process seemed kind of beautiful to me.
Yeah, and that like, depending on the age of the painting, and this is like becoming almost too nerdy, but depending on the age of the painting, I mean, it's like more or less brittle, and remember, depending on the material too. So and that, at the end of the day, like it goes back to like, this idea they have that like it's almost like an archaeological search, that I think that like even like a little particle of paint can just tell you like the whole story of like what was happening in terms of like materials, how old the piece is. So like if you look at it through a microscope, you would see like how old it is. It's really like almost like a DNA, right? Like taking a little skin or something, and it will like tell you a whole story about like age, materials. If you think about, well, if it's like acrylic paint, you will know it's done after like 1950. And if it's like oil paint, you can look at it through a microscope and see whether like the pigment is very fine. So that means more machines were in it. If it's like, chunky under a microscope and you see residues of minerals and so on, then you're like, okay, it's an older paint. That was the pigment was ground by hand and probably mixed with linseed oil. So I love that about painting, that I really think it's like, almost like recording the history of humanity through art. And I think it's pretty unique to painting, because a marble sculpture, it's a marble sculpture, right? Like it will, like if you do a marble sculpture like 100 years ago or a marble sculpture now, the material is still marble, right? Like it won't change its actual composition. But when it comes to painting, it really does keep changing. And that's why I wanted to include the car paint, because car paint is kind of incredible compared, like, if you think about an artist working like, like a really long time ago, like in the Renaissance or something, and to think how paint has really evolved to this like a spray paint that can be sprayed on, that's like super durable. So I just love to look at art like that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Analia, I know you have to leave in 5 minutes, but we have 2 questions coming from our audience at the museum. One of them is, what is it like working with a team to create work, and if that brings any challenges? And the other one is, if you have anything, if you're working on anything right now.
Okay, so the first one, is it like to work with a theme?
With a team. team of
Oh,
people?
with the team. Yeah, well, working with the team, I have to say it keeps me kind of healthy, because otherwise I'm motivated because they do show up every day. I mean, it's a very small team. We're only 4 people, including me, and everyone is very different. So we have a weaver. Weaving, it's like very detailed and it's really its own thing. And if I wanted to make my own weavings, like that's all, you know, that would be my practice, weaving. I wouldn't be able to do the other experiments. So one person is dedicated to weaving. Another person is dedicated to more like high-tech computer archiving, things like that. And then we only have one person in like general production to help me with like paint and preparing panels and things like that. So it's very, very small team, but I think it does keep me motivated. I need to like keep it healthy, show up every day, you know, do like, you know, show up on a normal schedule. I mean, I think it kind of has organized my life like in a healthy way. So, you know, no more crazy hours, which is what I used to do, you know, like the very early days. And so, yeah, I think the team has been, you know, like a very good part of the studio. And then in terms of what I'm working on now, I just opened last week this very big show in Los Angeles, and that really has to do, there was a commentary yesterday that said like the anxieties of this time, and I think that's pretty accurate. Like it's a very material show, so it's also made with like marble, you know, linen thread, copper, these copper tapestries, and then a lot of this encaustic paint. So it's like beeswax and resin from the trees. So very, very basic materials. But then in terms of the subject matter, it's really about like AI and cryptocurrencies and technology. So I thought it'd be like interesting to like, you know, bring those two words together in terms of like, we're still human, we're still people, we're very material based and we have a material existence, but then at the same time, we're very mediated by this like tech trend that's happening now. So like, or that's been happening for a long time. So I wanted to bring these 2 pieces together. It's called Synthetic Self, and it's in LA at the 2 galleries I work with. But you can see it online if you Google like Synthetic Self, and we can post it on the chat.
Thank you, Analia. Does anyone have any other questions for Analia? Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us. I just put a link to our survey, so you can leave a short review. And Analia, thank you so much for joining us and explaining all your work and the variety of concepts that you brought to the table.
Thank you, and I hope to see you in real life one day.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.